Our final mini lecture for the cognitive approach is going to talk about how we can use it in therapy to change personality, and then we'll have one final slide, which is a critique of strengths and weaknesses of the cognitive approach. Kelly thought that therapy that focused on childhood and trauma wasn't actually the most effective way to help people. He thought that therapy should focus on the person's current constructs and how they use those constructs in healthy or unhealthy ways to interpret the world and to internalize those to make their personality. So he thought that therapy should focus on defective construct systems or ways that you're interpreting the world that are not helpful. And again, Kelly thought that most problems in terms of depression, anxiety, personality were because we're not using constructs in this helpful or healthy way. He thought that a lot of problems that would come forward in therapy would be the result of anxiety. And again, for him, anxiety was caused by not being able to predict the world because your constructs are sort of failing you. So an example that points out sort of the way that our cognitions might not be helpful is this study by Clark and Teasdale in '84. And Kelly wasn't aware of the study. It happened after his theory, but it's just an example of how our cognitions might not help us. In this particular study, participants were given words, and they were then asked to remember any event in your life relevant to that word. So a word might be train. Tell me anything in your life having to do with a train. And what they found was that people who were high in clinical depression symptoms tended to relate negative or unhappy memories when given these cues, as opposed to people who were not depressed, who had a mixture of positive and negative events or mostly positive events. So the idea is that you might be depressed because the way you're interpreting the world is this negative construct, and that we could use therapy to get you to focus on positive memories or more optimistic things. So for Kelly, his way that he did that specifically as a technique, he was in fact a counseling psychologist, was what he called fixed role therapy. And basically the idea is that you come out of a counseling session with a new role that you're going to play in your mind. And so you might do that in the therapy session or kind of like as homework. So you could do this in two different ways. One way is that you could think of a person in your life with whom you're having a conflict and imagine the world from their perspective. So you could take on the role of your partner, for example, if you're having a lot of conflict with your partner, you're having a lot of misunderstandings. Okay, what I want you to do is for the next 20 minutes, talk to me about your world, but speak from the perspective of your partner. And the idea is that that helps you maybe empathize with them, see things from their perspective, take on the constructs that they're using, and that will help you relate to them and communicate with them. Another way that Kelly used fixed role therapy was to work on your ideal self. He didn't call it ideal self, but the idea was think of the type of person you'd like to be, and I want you for the next week in between this therapy session and when I see you again, act as if you are that person, act as if you are that ideal self. So let's say that you told me that you want to be more trusting and more generous toward other people. That's what your ideal self is. That's the part of your personality that you want to change. Okay, so then for the next week, every time you encounter another person, I want you to assume that they are trustworthy and to be generous toward them. Think about how can I help that person. Do that for a week and then come back and tell me how that goes. And so if you sort of enact the role of the type of person you want to be, eventually you will start to think from that perspective. You'll change your construct. And so Kelly's point of therapy was that we want to change your entire persona, your entire personality, not just focus in therapy on one little piece, one particular memory, one particular trauma from your childhood. We want to think about you as a whole person. Another therapist who came after George Kelly but was really important in developing cognitive therapy was Albert Ellis. Ellis's version of cognitive therapy was what he called rational emotive therapy, but it was very much in line with Kelly's perspective. Ellis thought that people often came to therapy because their cognitive processes were irrational. And he called this the ABC process. So A stood for an activating experience. There's some thing that gets you going in terms of your thought process. Then, as you interpret that event, you have an irrational belief. That's the B. Your cognitive reaction, your interpretation of the event is irrational and unhealthy. And that results in an emotional consequence. That's the C. So depression, anxiety, whatever. So those are the ABCs of thinking. So he said that what he would want to do is have clients come into his sessions, and he would tell them that their thought processes were irrational and unhealthy. A couple of specific examples of that were that clients would have these absolute types of thoughts that were irrational because they were 100% the world has to be this way or the world should be this way, and they don't allow for flexibility and mistakes and nuance. So he said absolute thinking was always going to be irrational because the world is never 100% the same way all the time. There were two specific types of absolute thoughts that he said were unhealthy. So consider the following examples of thoughts that a client might say in a therapy setting. So imagine you're a therapist and your client says something like, I am disappointed in myself because I need to be perfect all the time. I must gain perfection. I must achieve perfection. Or I must be liked and respected by every single person who meets me. I demand that everyone like and respect me. Or I am absolutely fair to everyone else, so everyone else should be absolutely fair to me. The other types of thoughts are, so those first three all have the word must in them, okay? So the word must is an absolute word. The other types of thoughts have the word should in them. So my life should always be convenient and gratifying, or my spouse should anticipate my needs. So we have must thoughts and we have should thoughts. Ellis said that both of these are absolute thoughts, which are unrealistic, and they're both irrational thoughts. There's things that you can't really maintain and stay happy. So Albert Ellis was a bit of a little amateur comedian. And he had kind of a dirty mind, which I sort of appreciate, right? I also have kind of a dirty mind. So he had this little joke about this type of thought. Remember that it's must thoughts and should thoughts. So if you are using these must thoughts, he had a little joke that that was called masturbation, right? So you should stop masturbating in front of me. And should thoughts, he said, you're shoulding all over yourself, right? So it sounds kind of like masturbation and shitting all over yourself. So he said masturbation and shoulding yourself are both bad because they're absolute and irrational. So for Ellis, the goals of therapy were to change those irrational, absolute thought processes, to be more flexible, to be more healthy, to have more rational, logical, nuanced kinds of thoughts. He wanted you to approach your world with patience, to not hold yourself to 100% types of standards, and to avoid that kind of absolute thinking when interpreting how other people are acting as well. So that was his perspective and why it's called cognitive therapy, because it's all about how are you interpreting the world, what kinds of attributions are you making, what kinds of standards are you holding for yourself and for other people. And if we can change those, that will cause you to have less anxiety, less depression, and might in fact change your personality. Our final slide for the cognitive approach is a critique of strengths and weaknesses of this approach. Some people really like this approach because they say it's a really nice combination of sort of the internal person and the external person, that our thoughts are the result of things that happen to us. A lot of people like that it's led to cognitive therapy. Kelly's ideas led to Ellis's ideas, and that's really the kind of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, which a lot of people like and use in counseling settings. And the whole idea that our personality is the result of the way that we interpret the world is a really interesting view of personality and different from the perspectives we've discussed already in this class. Some criticisms of the cognitive perspective are these ideas about constructs might be a little bit vague or hard to define or hard to do research on. There's less research on this perspective compared to something like the trait perspective because it's less concrete. Some people didn't like George Kelly's kind of ignoring childhood perspectives. I agree with this criticism. I would argue that the way that we construe the world is based on our childhood experiences. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that they certainly go together. And I think that if you were going to try to change someone's thought processes, you would want to know, why do you have those thought processes in the first place, right? What caused you to think about the world in that way? And as I already mentioned, there's still a lot more research needed on this perspective compared to the other perspectives. So I hope you enjoyed the cognitive perspective. Good luck on your quiz. As always, let me know if you have any questions.